Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. Now, as we've discussed on this show, there is a great need for a better approach to sustainable agriculture. Indeed, by mid-century, so by 2050, the world is going to need to be able to produce enough food to feed 10 billion people. And so there's definitely a space here where we need to think about how do we both grow and share food more efficiently and more sustainably. Our guest today is going to help give us a better perspective on what is the vision for the future of food. His name is Dr. Andy Jarvis, and he's the director of the Future of Food at the Bezos Earth Fund. Andy has worked for over 20 years in research for development and support for the delivery of food security and environmental sustainability in the food system. He joined the Bezos Earth Fund from the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT, a CGIAR center, where he oversaw research that spans from crop breeding and genetics to landscape management, climate adaptation, and mitigation through to dietary shifts and consumer behavior. Andy holds a PhD in geography from King's College London and is located in Cali, Colombia. But before we begin the show, let's start with this. This Foodie Pharmacology podcast is part of a special series co designed with the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, also known as the PTFI. The views and opinions in this podcast are those of the presenters and represent the synthesis of science. The PTFI is a program of RF Catalytic Capital managed by a collaborative team at the American Heart Association and the Alliance of Biodiversity, CIAT, that seeks to advance our fundamental understanding of food composition by providing tools, data, and training to scientists across the globe so they can better characterize the quality of the world's edible biodiversity. The PTFI's ultimate goal is to advance data driven solutions in the food sector for the health of people and the planet. Funding for the PTFI is provided by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, C-RAVE Foundation, Fourfold Foundation, and Atria Health Collaborative. All right, Andy. Well, thanks so much for coming on this show. It's really great to meet you.
Totally welcome. Hi, thanks. Good to meet you.
Yeah. So maybe we can just start with a little bit of basic context about your current role with the Bezos Earth Fund. What is your role and kind of what is the mission of this initiative?
I've joined the Bezos Earth Fund. I've been here for about a year now, and so I'm the director for the Future of Food. It's the part of the portfolio that looks at food in particular. And the Bezos Earth Fund looks at things. We're basically in this twin crisis of a biodiversity and nature crisis and a climate crisis, as well as all of then the challenges that we're having on the social and the economic side as well across the planet. But we're looking at that at this kind of we see ourselves in the middle of those two crises. How do we address the nature crisis and the climate crisis and bring about catalytic change? And the food system is like absolutely in the core of this. It's in the center of it. It's a huge chunk of emissions globally. It's, we talk about food as a victim of climate change. It's very much getting, the farmers are out there on the front line. Food is the first thing really that is feeling the effects of climate often. We have food as a problem. It's 1/3 of global emissions. It's 2/3 of ice-free land is being used for food production. I mean, we like terraformed our planet basically for the food system. But it's also a solution to the climate and nature crisis. I think, food is the only sector where you can turn emissions around and actually sink carbon into the soil and into these systems. And so it's right at the core of many of the solutions to this. So what we're doing is we're looking at this as a very holistic thing. How do we feed 10 billion people within planetary boundaries, and what needs to really change in the food system? And it's big change. It's transformative change. It's not really just incremental little tweaks around the edges.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about some of the challenges that we face right now in agriculture, in the mention of terraforming, I mean, one of our challenges is the state of our soil, right? That we have challenges with soil composition. We also have challenges with access to land, and we have challenges with the biodiversity of organisms in our food systems. So which of these are you focused on most right now, or are there different programs kind of addressing all of these together in parallel?
I mean, first of all, everything is connected in the food system. I always kind of talk about it. It's like this nebulous big fog of so many things going on. It's very hard, when people say, well, what is the food system? It's hard to answer that question. It's a really difficult one, without spending 20 minutes doing it. But it's also, I the key thing is that everything is connected in the food system. And so it's very hard to, you can pick something here and you try and fix that there, but that has impacts, just like in any complex system that has a whole range of then impacts elsewhere. So first of all, it's very hard to just kind of tunnel vision, just say, all right, we're going to fix this. You have to think about the whole system, and you have to think about it as a system and a system thinker, but find the leverage points. And so, one of the leverage points that we've certainly seen and we're focused in on is an area that we call sustainable protein. Animal source foods for good and bad have the biggest footprint, be it emissions, huge footprint in terms of emissions, 15% globally. It's a huge footprint in terms of land. So 2/3 of the land that's used for the food system is for livestock or for feed for livestock. So it's, the biggest chunk of land. But it's also, I think the statistic is 1.3 billion people on this planet, one way or another, depend on livestock for their livelihoods. And so, it's also a huge social and economic piece of the food system. So that's where we're kind of particularly focused at the moment. What does the kind of protein and all of the other nutrients that are coming from the nutrition that comes from animal source foods, what does that look like in the 21st century, where we have 10 billion people, growing population, increasing demand for meat every day, and in certain regions like Africa, especially in Asia, huge population increase as well, and raising income. So the demand for meat is can be as much as double by 2050. And so we got to really think, what does this look like this century? How do we bring livestock and kind of all of the and animal source foods into a more sustainable space?
Do you think that's even possible? I mean, when I think about the growing human population and this desire for meat, I mean, even now, as we're trying to, concentrate our meat kind of cultivation or production systems. I'm thinking in particular of CAFOs, where you have these concentrated feedlots. These are really dependent upon the use of antibiotics and other things that are not great for us or the environment to be able to enable that kind of density of animals. And if we're talking about growing that sector, do you think that there is a path forward for sustainability with such a dense population in livestock? It's hard for me to see that just based on disease ecology. I don't know how we get around the disease aspect with such concentrated animal numbers.
Yeah, I mean, this is the classic cop-out answer from any scientist. It depends, and I think there is a path, but it's multiple paths, and I think, the world is an incredibly diverse place. There are many different ways of producing meat and dairy and animal source foods. And, there's a place for many of those systems in different contexts. The antimicrobial resistance, all of the kind of use of antibiotics out of control, especially in those feedlot systems. And that's not good for human health. That is not at all, healthy. It's also not great for animal welfare or anything like that. I mean, I think the inconvenient truth is they're actually very efficient as a kind of industrialized system of producing meat and dairy. It's actually very efficient, but it's not efficient in any other sense of the word, and it's not, I don't think, acceptable in a 21st century developed human society. So I don't think that's certainly not the answer, but there are ways of producing livestock in certain areas where you can have very high productivity, very good efficiency, low. I've been to farms, in fact, where you have cattle and it's actually a carbon sink, a net carbon sink, so you can have 1,000 animals wandering around, but you've got trees involved, you've got deep rooting pastures, and you can actually create a carbon sink from that. That's where you turn the food system around. Instead of being a net emitter, it can be a sink. So you can achieve those things in the right places. But the way we see it is, it's kind of there's no silver bullet on this. There's no one single pathway. It's we kind of see it as an all of the above approach, in the sense that we need to make livestock more sustainable, but we also need to be promoting plant-rich diets. And there's many sources that we can get of proteins and many of the micronutrients that are in in beef and chicken and pork. There are other sources for this that can be more sustainable, especially on plant-rich diets. So we call it a kind of all of the above approach,
Yeah.
in the sense, let's make livestock more sustainable, but also let's double down on diets that are more diverse and using the vast majority, all of this diversity of plants that we can that have amazing nutrition.
Yeah, I like this idea of a plant forward diet where it's not eliminating meat, but it's really with plants the centerpiece of the diet and meat's more of, a flavoring or a side piece rather than the main course. And this is very common in many traditional diets too. It's where you have a very plant forward diet. What about
Yeah.
insects? I have to ask this because I'm very curious about, the role that entomophagy can play down the road. Have you guys touched on this at all? Of this idea of edible insects, both in livestock feed, but also for human nutrition?
Yeah, I mean, I have been exploring the insect thing. I mean, I think, first of all, right now, most of the insects that are produced are going to pet food. So, some of your pets at home might be eating it. A lot of it, that's really where it's worked, generally speaking. But insects in Africa, for example, for a large proportion of society there is a part of the diet. It's not a strange thing. I remember eating grasshoppers in Kampala once in Uganda. And I guess for Western tastes, it's a little bit gross when it's the full insect. It's actually quite tasty. I quite liked it, and it's so rich in protein. But I think you can transform it in ways that it is an incredibly efficient source of protein. If you are going to per gram of protein produced, you can't really beat insects in terms of the efficiency side of things. But, I think, it's one part of the solution, but I don't think it's necessarily the big part of the solution, and I do think, one of the things that we're quite passionate about is pulses from a plant forward perspective, pulses, very important. And, one of the things that we work on is this campaign called Beans is How. And I don't know if you've come across Beans is How, but I describe it as the answer to, life, the universe, and everything else. How do what should I eat to, be more sustainable? Well, beans is how, how, as a farmer, what can I produce that's going to be nice to my soil? Well, beans is how. It's kind of no one likes to be told what they should eat, what they shouldn't eat. But it's a kind of no regret thing, eat more beans. And everyone nods. Everyone looks like you, Cassandra. It's like, yeah, beans is a good thing. So we're trying to, with this beans, is how can we double bean consumption across the planet by 2028? And that will have great benefits to planet on the sustainability side. It's good in many parts of the world, especially in Western societies. It's great for your pocket, the economics as well of it.
Absolutely.
They're cheap and they're nutritious and they're tasty. But it's also great for your health. It's a real no regret thing. Eat more beans and you're going to be getting much better and healthier guts. And, your gut health goes up and you're going to be full of great nutrition. So the beans is a good one. That really, I think, needs to be at the center of our plates in the future.
That's a great point. I mean, you also have enrichment of the soil through the nitrogen fixating bacteria growing on these beans and the root systems. Are there particular types of beans that you all are looking into more so than others, or just really any kind of bean?
Well, at least the campaign is looking at it as a kind of a loose sense.
term.
It's really
Mhm.
pulses is how. I mean, it doesn't have the same ring to it. Beans is how kind of works, but it's really pulses. So that's everything. All the types of bean, common bean, mung bean, and so on, but also chickpeas and lentils. All of those things. They all share a very similar nutritional profile of being stacked full of all sorts of goodness. So it's a kind of general thing for pulses. How can we just eat more pulses? And what generally happens, is as society has kind of developed, we've left those behind and instead eat more meat. And it's not necessarily, and it's kind of replaced and dropped the pulses. So, pulses over the years has just gone down and down and down in consumption. And I think that's the wrong direction of travel. I think it needs to go up.
So when we think about, other elements of the diet system or of our planetary health as it ties into human health, we have pulses, perhaps reduction in the amount of meat or more plant forward diets. But what other types of actions can folks take at home, even as we're planning out our weekly menus based on the science? Like, what does the science tell us? More pulses, more plant forward, anything else we should be thinking about?
So I've thought about this quite a lot because I mean you have to it's a very abstract thing about the sustainability of the food system, and you can explain all of the problems and some of the things you can do, and you lose people very quickly. For anyone who just asks me what should I do to be more sustainable and more healthy, with what I eat, the first thing I say is kind of what's good for you is also generally good for the planet. There's very few exceptions to that rule. So a lot of the good stuff that is kind of known to be great for the human diet, pulses, starting with things like pulses and a lot of the kind of fiber rich crops and things, those are good for the planet as well. So that that's the first thing. It's not a trade-off, right? So you can actually really just think about your own diet and eating good stuff, and it's probably going to help the planet. And that's smaller portions of meat. It's less consumption of red meat. It's plant-rich diet. It's very diverse. It's lots of fruit, lots of vegetables, which fruit and vegetables, generally you can produce a lot of good stuff on much less land than cereals and so on. So, all of that is simple. But what I kind of say is, if I look out for three things, one is don't waste your food. You think 1/3 of food is lost or wasted on the planet. And if you think about all of the big numbers from a planetary perspective, if it's 1/3 of emissions globally, the food system, so 1/3 of that 1/3 is produced, it's emissions produced for absolutely nothing because it gets thrown away. So, the old thing of your mum telling you don't waste your food was, it was maybe, for a different reason, but today don't waste your food for the planet. So that's, that's one. It's just the land footprint as well. It's like, if you reduce food loss and waste significantly, you free up so much land that can go back to nature, that can be used for, to generate ecosystem services and all this kind of stuff. Don't waste your food. Second is choose your protein wisely. That is really where the huge leverage of, the difference between one plate of food and the other in terms of its carbon emissions is most likely defined by the kind of the protein on it. Is it beef? Most inefficient. Pork? Well, I'll go in order, like beef, lamb, pork, chicken, fish, and then way out over there. And then you got, insects and pulses, and so, that's really critical. And I mean, I was just this morning had a conversation about this idea of climate conscious catering. And a team kind of took on the challenge, and they went from, kind of looking at a plate of food and trying to get it down to the minimum that basically provides all of the nutrition that you need. And what they found is the difference between from where they started, it was, 7 kilos of carbon emissions per plate of food, down to half. So you can actually, deliver all the nutrition that humans need with a tiny fraction of the emissions if you get it right. So choose your protein wisely. That's the second. Then the third is kind of think about how it was produced, and that can make massive difference as well. And there are systems, the crops that are produced in highly unsustainable ways, which are not only, screwing the climate and affecting nature, but doing all sorts of other stuff in terms of, pollution of rivers and so on. So how it is produced makes a big difference. And one of the myths that I always like to say to people is everyone gets worried about food miles, and food miles are a tiny piece of it. They're in a plate of food, the food miles is probably less than 2% of the emissions. So an apple produced efficiently in New Zealand is going to be much better for the planet to move that from New Zealand to California or to UK or whatever than an apple grown locally in inefficient, unsustainable ways. So the food miles are not important. So those are the three. How is it produced? Choose your protein wisely, and no food loss and waste.
Now, those are great points. I think it's difficult for consumers to really make those distinctions, right? To know, like, how do I understand what's going to be most sustainable or not? I was just in Brussels last week for work, and there was a restaurant that had, little symbols with each dish you could choose, like based on its sustainability rating. I thought that was kind of nice. I was like, this is a nice little guide. And of course, the more plant forward had the lowest of the kind of carbon imprints.
The thing is, I mean, they had experiments, especially in Amsterdam and things. They actually put, just like you have the number of calories written on menus in the US now, they did also the carbon footprint written. Mm-hmm. And they did experiments, and they kind of, researchers went in and kind of looked at choices. And basically they came to the conclusion that no one was making choices based on that.
like whatever you prefer to eat. Okay. Well, let, let's talk a little bit about food composition, because this also relates to, location and where it could be coming from in terms of like distance from harvest to consumption. And I wanted to see if you could share with us a little bit about the Periodic Table of Food initiative and why such an initiative is important to our understanding of both of how foods fit into this dynamic system of, planetary and human health.
Yeah, no, great. And this was, and this is really kind of from my previous life. So in my previous life, in my previous role, which was at the Alliance of Biodiversity International in Seattle, I helped kind of set up the secretariat for the Periodic Table of Food. And I must admit, it was one of those, I worked on lots of projects and programs and stood a lot of things up. This one was kind of my baby. I was really excited about it, and I'll describe it kind of, I think, first of all, we're on the cusp of an absolute revolution in terms of understanding what is in food, and all the food labeling that you'll see, it talks about the amount of protein, the amount of carbohydrate, if you're lucky, you get, a few vitamins, you might get a little bit of iron or whatever in there. But, that is such a massive generalization of what you're actually eating, and so, I think just because of the science right now, we're on the cusp of an absolute revolution in understanding what's in food. I think that's super exciting. But the relevance of that, I think, is really important. And one point I've kind of always made, when we had all the, the kind of the COVID vaccine, and you had all of these people kind of, I won't name names, but, the anti-vaxxers kind of arguing, I don't know what's in that. I'm not injecting it in my arm. Every day you are consuming something and sticking it in your body and you have no idea what's in it. So, that argument just doesn't work, and, if you're really true to that and you don't, you'll only put in your body what, stop eating because you have no idea what you're ingesting. So, I think we don't know what's going in. We don't know what that is doing to our body. And I think, this combination of, first of all, a revolution in the food composition, understanding all of these compounds that are in there and being able to actually identify them and name them, together with understanding then what that does in terms of human health and how, all of the things that it can do. The relevance of it is, I can go into some of the details of how this, what impacts it could have. But I think, it's going to be fascinating. We can really think about our diets as, in a much more kind of precise way of how to, it goes for everything, just from, kind of food as medicine through to understanding, also going backwards in the food system and understanding how different production techniques change the food composition and how that different food composition affects the body. So all that, all those, antibiotics that you're consuming from feedlot animals in these intensive feed systems, we're going to start to understand, well, what is the trace of those things? How are they moving through the food system? How are you then ingesting them? What are they doing to your human health? And, in the short term, in the medium term, long term. So that's the Periodic Table of Food. I think it's at the right time where the technology is going to get us there in terms of understanding it. And then it'll just open up so many doors. There'll be researchers that, can spend the next 40 years going through this data.
No, I'm really excited about it. It's like you said, it's really putting some science behind not just crop yield with, for example, with regenerative agriculture, but really like what are the health values of these foods following different forms of agriculture, and how does that translate into our health outcomes? I think that's really exciting. And I'm wondering, do you have any examples of, where you might see that data being used, or any kind of more specific ways that it could be used that you could share with us, or how this might tie into the larger picture with the Bezos Fund?
We've thought about the kind of the relevance of this PTFI in a few contexts. One is going back to farming practices, and we don't understand, everyone, we kind of, people eat organic food and we talk about regenerative ag and, and there's kind of, everything from, very good production practices through to very bad ones. We don't really have a good grip of what that means in terms of, when you eat it, what it does to you. So, that's one. I think it can really inform what, not only what is kind of good production from a perspective of, be it, sustainability or equity in the production system, or be it, animal welfare or whatever, that was what we were looking at before. But now we can track the relevance of that all the way through to human health. And, it was always a kind of giant leap of faith that if we eat, organic and we eat less, less chemicals in our food and things, it's going to be better for us. But, there's very poor kind of evidence of exactly what those chemicals are doing to us. And they're chipping away. I'm sure they're chipping away at human health, but we don't really understand how it is. So, I think that's something that's one that's interesting. I mean, the other things is I always use the example of the pandemic. In the pandemic, I kind of felt like I got so in tune with what I was eating that it blew my mind in the sense that I could, because I was just at home and we were doing cooking every day, our own food, and I was sourcing, from a local farmer, the products, the produce and stuff. I kind of knew everything that was coming in. I knew what we were doing to it, and then I was eating it. I wasn't going out, and and I felt I'd eat something, and you could feel like the effect on your brain on lethargy, or certain things would make you kind of just like be on it. Other ones would be like you'd be tired after eating it in the afternoon, and you became so much more tuned to it. And I think a lot of people went through that during the pandemic, and you kind of lose it when you start eating out and you kind of start just messing, kind of eating more for convenience. But that's happening every day. And I always use the example, when I was little, when I was doing exams, someone told me that eat a banana before an exam because you'll be smarter. Right? I had no idea. It's just like eat a banana and you'll be smarter. It sounded like a good idea. So I'd always eat a banana. But now, you can really understand how eating that banana stimulates the brain. What does it do in your body, and what compounds are in there, and how are they doing that? So, I think that's the level of understanding we're going to get, how individual foods can be kind of stimulating all sorts of things in your body for good and bad, but also how diets and, plates and combinations of things can be. So I think, we're going to it's going to be this whole kind of new awareness, basically, of the role of food and human health and also the planetary side of things, sustainability.
It's amazing. No, I love this idea of mindful eating. And I think you're 100% right that many of us unintentionally, just out of being forced to, cook at home during the pandemic, really learned to have a different relationship with our food and the way it makes us feel. And I love that analogy. It's really about getting the science behind and understanding the chemistry and pharmacology of our foods to better appreciate why we feel the way we do after eating certain things. That's really, I think, an exciting part of the future of food. Well, speaking of the future of food, I was reading on the Bezos Earth Fund website that this fund has committed $1 billion to transforming kind of agricultural and food systems. And that's an incredible amount. And I think that's really exciting. And it opens up the, many potential pathways to kind of pursue this line of inquiry. And I'm wondering, what can you share with us about the types of projects that the fund is currently working with? What types of things are happening? Are these happening across the globe? Are these projects primarily with farmers or with chefs, or kind of what's within the scope of this overall mission?
Oh, great. Yeah, I love talking about this. So, as I explained at the start, we're looking at this kind of nexus of climate and nature and the food system right in the mix of that. So, we're looking at how can we reduce the emissions? How can we free up land for more nature? How can we basically produce good, nutritious food for 10 billion people on less land with lower emissions? It's simple. But, I think that, the program that we're developing in this is everything from quite upstream R&D. I think real innovations and technologies that are going to make a big difference. As I said, I think the changes that we need to make are not little tweaks. We're not going to reach a sustainable food system by just tweaking around the edges. We really need to actually fundamentally change it. And so we're working kind of on innovations, kind of upstream R&D and things like that. But then going all the way, downstream on the ground, what does good practice, farming practice look like? What should we be designing in terms of a food system delivering, protein for 10 billion people? What's the mix between plants and animals in this? So we're looking kind of at, quite broadly at things. Some examples of what we do is we provide grants generally to either research organizations or not-for-profit organizations in civil society working towards these outcomes. An example, on a kind of more upstream side of things, for example, we've got working on collars for cows. So one of our grants was to Cornell University, and that's about a collar that can go on cows that will kind of help them, train them through sounds, through vibrations, to not need fencing. So what we can do is introduce rotation for cows so that they, if we've got a 100-hectare farm, this day the cows are in this 2 hectares, next day they're in that, and so on. And it's the collar that is controlling that. So you don't have to cut down fence posts. You don't have to be using electric fences and all of this, which is costly. And especially in areas which are very extensive and generally the most inefficient production systems, how can we introduce this as a technology that will increase the sustainability of those systems? So that's the kind of example of the quite upstream work. We're also looking at things like practice standards in the US, for example, farmers get practice standards to access federal funds. And so we're working in the kind of the policy space with, how can we improve those practice standards to be incentivizing the best practice on the farm that is going to be delivering, high quality products, profitability for farmers, but also sustainability. And we're just getting going. I'm 1 year in and we're just rolling a lot of this out. The commitment is 1 billion by 2030. And so, we're going to build up a beautiful portfolio of all sorts of things. And I think, at the center of this, and this is where it relates back to PTFI, one of the centers of this is really around the protein challenge of what if every, person on the planet ate like the average, European or Brazilian or Argentinian or American with massively high consumption of meat, we'd run out of planet tomorrow, right? I mean, there's no way we just can't sustain that. And so, we're interested in thinking, well, what is the right mix of meat, animal source foods? Where should we be producing those with plant-rich alternatives? And also, we're interested in the space of kind of plant-based meats and the kind of alternative protein space as well. There's people that will, eat meat, always will eat meat, couldn't ever kind of consider not eating meat. And so we need to provide choices. So it's really about, developing more choices for consumers that are more sustainable.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, that's incredibly exciting that this is such an ambitious project. I mean, that's 7 years to spend $1 billion in pushing the future of food rapidly forward. I think that's really a tremendous opportunity to do a lot of exciting work. And I like the idea of the remote, I guess not remote controlled cows, but almost in a way, because you're using these collars to help herd and better manage your herds that way. Well, one other question, I know we've talked about land-based proteins in terms of both livestock and plant protein. What about our fisheries? The oceans are also in a state of crisis, as I'm sure you well know, and our management of marine sites also presents a challenge. Is that also something that you're kind of keeping in mind when you're thinking about these systems approaches?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. The issue, I mean, the whole issue of blue foods, right? I mean, first of all, fish, incredibly valuable from a nutritional perspective. The kind of, we should be eating more fish, but we don't have a great track record of production of fisheries, be it aquaculture or be it, in our oceans. We don't have a great track record of being sustainable on that, and so it's actually, when you dig into it, like salmon, salmon is like a wonder food in the sense of all of the, the oils and the, the omegas and all of from a composition perspective, it's fantastic for human diet, right? But when you start looking, going into what's in that, and a lot of experts, many experts really actually that, have gone into this, don't eat salmon, despite it being so, kind of nutritionally great. It's, generally there's all sorts of problems again with antibiotics and,
with farm salmon or with wild salmon?
Yeah.
Farmed,
Farm salmon, yeah. Wild salmon. Then you've got other kind of questions of, ecosystem integrity and,
exactly.
Are they being sustainably harvested and so on and so forth. So it's a tough one. Blue foods is a critical piece of the food system, but it's one just littered with kind of conflicts and trade-offs and difficulties. So, I think it's an area that, the Earth Fund, one of the things we've been doing, for example, in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, has been working on protected areas. How do we create much bigger protected areas in our oceans? Protect, in marine protected areas. And one of the things that it shows is interesting is, when the analysis is like, I think there was one great study in Hawaii, which basically showed that by establishing a protected area, the profitability and first of all, the sustainability of the system and, protection of marine life goes up. But at the same time, for the fishermen and, the fisher folk and so on, the people that depend on the sea for their livelihoods, also actually enhance their income and their livelihoods, because we were protecting stocks, and you basically the catches were bigger and better around those protected areas. So I think, one of the things is we've just got to bring into harmony this is where really, where we look at protection, restoration, and transforming our food, the three things that we look at in our nature portfolio. Those three together in oceans can actually be very beneficial.
Now, that's such a great point. I think there has to be, to be successful, we have to have this very holistic approach that's, multifactorial in how we go about these things. I mean, would you say, Andy, we're running low on time, so I just want to wrap up with, kind of one last bigger vision question. In the news, we're constantly bombarded with bad things, bad news about climate change, bad news about our food systems. As a scientist and as someone that's kind of directing these new initiatives and how do we address these changes, do you find yourself optimistic or pessimistic about our future of food? Kind of where do you stand, and, what nuggets of wisdom can you share there?
It depends what side of the bed I got out in the morning. I think I go from another podcast that I love to watch is Outrage and Optimism, and I think that captures the kind of the schizophrenia that you feel. On the one hand, I mean, it is, my background's in geography and I understand kind of Earth systems and so on, and I mean, we really are on the edge of many of these systems, of complete collapses, of tipping points in the climate system. What happens in the next 5 to 7 years is really going to be absolutely critical. We call it the decisive decade. I mean, if we don't take it seriously, there's no coming back from what we're going to face in terms of climate change and the nature crisis. So, in that sense, yeah, it's pretty scary. In the food system, I mean, as I said, you see technologies and you see what's around the corner. The capacity of humans to innovate is incredible. And if we really do focus that energy on that innovation capacity, on the right things, and we really do strive, instead of striving for kind of a race to the bottom of how do you provide the cheapest kind of worst food to people, with the worst methods, right? But, it's very much been a drive of economy of just, the cheaper, the better, the more efficient. And that's gone against planetary health and also human health. And I think if we rebalance that and we use our innovation to think about a much more balanced view of that, I am very hopeful. And it is incredible how much has changed in the food system. If you just look at the massive transformations, the changes that have happened in the last 40 years, we can transform them again, but it really does need concerted effort. Yeah. So I mean, that's why from my role, having, this commitment of $1 billion by 2030 on transforming food systems, it's super exciting because there is so much we can do and so much we need to do. It's also terrifying because we, this is really, I mean, we're talking huge responsibility that not just, us with, the Bezos Earth Fund, but everyone working in the food system, huge responsibility to really rethink and be bold and be brave about what needs to change.
I love that. We have to be bold and we have to be brave. Thank you, Andy, for sharing these insights. This was really interesting and inspirational. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. All right. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. You can find this and all of our other episodes on our website at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also find the full video version of this episode at the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel. Thanks so much for listening. I also want to send a shout out of thanks to our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for putting on a great show. And thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in each week. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.